Well, good evening, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Um, Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everybody is connected and that you can all hear me. Can you just do me a favor and click on the raise hand icon if you can hear me right now? Looks like a good sign. Looks like people can hear me. Excellent. Let me first of all, I think we're going to have a brief session tonight, but I'm glad we have a chance to have at least this short session. I don't know what the weather is like where you live. It turned out to be pretty nasty up here. Very cold, windy, extremely windy. Looks like we got about 5 inches or so. Hard to tell because there's a lot of drifting. I hope you've all had a good, safe day. And it turns out that this is the only option we really would have had because, as you may have heard, LaSalle actually decided to close for the day. So we wouldn't have been able to meet in person anyways. So I think we'll have a short session. So tonight's topic is on forced rating distributions. And there's two pieces to that. I'm going to talk briefly about that issue, but there's also a really good chapter by Pete Dominick that's on Canvas on this topic. And I want to place this in context for you to start with. Anybody who is making decisions about a performance management process in any organization faces two questions. The first question is, will you have ratings of some kind? That is, will people at some point in the year receive some kind of a performance rating or some overall performance rating? The vast majority of organizations so far, their answer to that question is yes. But as you'll see when you read some of the things on the topic of the end of ratings, not everybody agrees, and there are some companies that don't do that. That raises a whole host of issues. But that's one decision, and it's one decision that somebody needs to think through and have a good justification for in the real world, and hence it's something you'll need to think through and have a good justification for in your application paper. If, like most companies, you wind up deciding to have some kind of overall performance rating, you decide on that, then a second issue happens. And the second issue is, will you try to control the distribution of the ratings that people can get? For example, one alternative is to say, well, every boss can rate every employee however he or she likes. If you want to give all of your employees very, very favorable ratings, that's fine. If you want to give them all ratings in the middle of the scale, that's fine. Whatever you want to do is really entirely fine. No constraints on you. But many companies, for reasons we'll discuss in a minute, do not go down that path, and they argue that they want to impose some kind of structure on how the ratings need to be distributed. That in turn leads to a whole host of other issues, and that's what we want to talk about tonight. So again, in the real world, people need to make that decision about whether or not they want to force the nature of the rating distribution or allow it to just float freely however each boss wants to make it. That's a real world decision, and hence it's a real world decision for the application paper. So with that said, let me get started and just show you a couple things here. Imagine as you take a look at these ratings that one of the people working in your organization is named Joe, and Joe has a team of people reporting to Joe. Um, and let's assume that it's not just 3 or 4 people. Maybe Joe has 10 or 15 people, whatever. And that this is what the rating distribution looks like for Joe's team at the end of the year. As you can see by looking at this, Joe has given most of his people very high ratings, a 5 rating. And almost all the people on Joe's team have either a 4 or a 5 rating. In fact, 90% of them have a 4 or a 5 rating. Okay. So I've certainly seen this happen. And when you see this distribution of ratings, one question you can ask is this a reasonable set of ratings that Joe has provided for Joe's team? Is that reasonable? Here's another set of ratings. Imagine you have another boss, another manager in your organization whose name is Karen. Karen also has a team of people reporting to her. Karen's team, again, is not small. Again, maybe 10, 15, 20 people. And this is the distribution of Karen's ratings. Same organization. Here we see a very different distribution. Karen has given only 20% of people a 5. But 50% of Karen's people are rated in the middle of the rating scale. They're getting a 3. Again, very few of Karen's people are rated below the midpoint, but the majority are in the middle of the rating scale. So this is something, again, I've seen a lot. So that's Karen's ratings. Keep those in mind. Okay. Let's take a look at another set of ratings here. Same organization. Gary is another manager. At the end of the year, you look at Gary's ratings. Here's Gary's ratings. 70% of the people get a 3. Very few people get a 2 or a 1, but very few people get a 5, and not many people get a 4. So the vast majority of people are getting a 3. And let me pause for a minute and just comment on why I'm using a 5-point rating scale. And that's because I've seen ongoing research on organizations and surveys of organizations about what kind of rating scale they use. By far, the most common rating scale that organizations use is a 5-point rating scale. Some use a 3-point, some use a 4-point, some use a 7-point, but by far the most common is a 5-point rating scale. The vast majority use a 5-point rating scale, where 5 is high and 1 is low. The labels might be different from what I'm using here, but 5 is high and 1 is low. So those are our 3 sets of rating distributions from 3 managers. And if I look at each one of those, I might have some questions about them. But let's put them all side by side. So now I'm looking at 3 important managers in my organization, and these are their rating distributions. So my question to all of you is a fairly simple one, and it's to ask kind of, if you're looking at all this kind of side by side, is this a concern for you? Is it a concern? Well, I've opened a poll here, and I'll ask you to vote. Are you concerned? We'll let everybody vote. I've got one more person to vote here. Okay. Thank you for doing that. I'm going to close that poll, and So I just need to ask you a technical question at this point. As I close that poll, okay, right now, I need to find out whether or not you are still seeing the poll, or whether or not you are seeing the screen, my slide that says that has the data from Joe's team and Karen's team and Gary's team. Can somebody just let me know by typing what you're seeing? Yeah, you're seeing the screen, is that right? Anybody else want to just duplicate that? Mohammed says he's seeing the screen. That's good news. You're seeing the PowerPoint slide. That's good. Good. Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Last night when I was looking at the video recording that I made last night, it looked to me like in the video recording that you guys were always seeing the polls, that the polls never closed off the screen. And one of the weird things about GoToTraining is that you would think I can always see what you're seeing, but life is not quite that simple. So let me share the result of the poll with you. 57% of people said they think that's a problem. 21% said they do not, and 21% aren't sure. And oddly enough, I actually think any one of these three answers could be justified, and let me explain why. But as a beginning point, when we look at these things, if what I don't know for sure, we might initially look at this and we might say, listen, Joe seems to be extraordinarily lenient. Whereas Gary seems to be the opposite. And that might be true. But of course, we have to ask ourselves the question, is it possible that Joe just happens to have a team that has an extraordinary number of very talented people on it, whereas Gary's team has is simply weaker and has less talent? We don't have any objective way of answering that question. In other words, I'm simply saying here, we don't know for sure what the quote correct unquote rating distribution should be for each of the three people. We don't know because we don't have any objective way of determining how good the people are on Joe's team, Karen's team, and Gary's team. But I certainly, and hence, that could lead me to a not sure. But the reason why I tend to lean towards a yes answer to this question, and again, I think any three of these answers could be reasonable ones, is because I know this. If people see these rating distributions, or if they hear about them, if you're on Karen's team or you're on Gary's team, you're likely to feel that something is wrong, that somehow your boss is not rating you fairly, or at least not rating people on your team fairly compared to Joe's, that somehow Joe's team is getting an advantage. And we might say, well, why does that matter? Well, it might matter a lot if your pay rating, your pay decision in terms of the magnitude of your salary increase is tied to the number of your rating, right? Whether you're a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Because if that turns out to be the case, Joe's people will be getting higher salary increases than will Karen's and then will Gary's, right? And hence, even if these ratings happen to be accurate, and I have no way of knowing if they are, even if they were actually accurate, I know we're going to have a perceptual problem. And that creates an issue. This issue, therefore, leads some companies to say, what we need to do is have a forced distribution of ratings. We can't allow ratings to be wildly different from one group to another group. And so many companies have adopted this posture, including companies I've done consulting work with. And I understand their rationale for it. And I understand the rationale of people who don't want to do it as well. And by far the most common forced distribution of ratings I have seen looks like the ratings for Gary's team. Did some work with a large consumer product company over the course of 7 or 8 years in doing some training for them around their performance management process, and conducting a number of interviews and focus groups and other things around that process as well. And this was almost exactly their target. Gary's distribution was almost exactly their target distribution. Their expectation was that about 65 to 70% of their employees would receive a 3. And they described a 3 as being a valued employee. That's what they called a 3. And they chose that word carefully because they were trying to convey the idea that, look, at the vast majority of our employees are people who we value a lot. And therefore, we want you to understand that in fact, we're a very successful company, which was true. We tend to outperform other people in our industry in the market, in the equity market, and that was also true. And we couldn't do that if the vast majority of our employees were not valuable to us. And so being a 3 is a valued employee. But a few people could get 4s or 5s, but 5s were extremely rare. No more than 1 out of 10 people in the company was allowed to receive a 5, and a small number of people received 1s or 2s, although they didn't have any quota for receiving 1s or 2s. Now, again, I'm just pointing that out as this was the rationale of this one particular company. Okay, and I've seen many other companies that have very similar kinds of rationales. So, this raises some interesting questions. Is it okay? Does it make sense to rank employees at some level from best to worst? Is that realistic? And does it matter? I think for the most part, ranking employees doesn't work. Rating employees is better, but ratings have problems too. There's a wonderful article, though. It's really short. It's on Canvas, and it's under this particular module, and I encourage you to just take a quick look at it. It's called "The Worst Doctor at Harvard Medical School," and it makes a really interesting point. It says that every year, if you look at the graduating class from Harvard Medical School, the doctors who graduate from Harvard Medical School, they're ranked from top to low, right? Now, as you can see, based on their overall performance throughout their medical program, high to low. So that's known within Harvard. Okay, it's not known outside of Harvard, but it's known within Harvard. And the question is, every year, one of those people is the lowest ranked doctor completing Harvard Medical School. Of the, I don't know how many, couple hundred doctors completing Harvard Medical School, this is the lowest ranked doctor. And the writer of the article asks a really good question. They said, do you know what that person is called? And you might already know what that person is called. That person is called a Harvard Medical School doctor. And the question is, would it make any difference to you? Do you think they're all equivalent? Or would you be more interested, if you were seeing a physician, you'd like to see somebody toward the top of that class? If you're like most of us, you'd like to see somebody toward the top of that class. Not even from Harvard would you probably like to see the person who's at the bottom of the class. And this just suggests to me that the issue of of rating employees matters at some level. Most commonly, when companies force a distribution, they do something like what I described in Gary's group. It takes a very crude approximation to a normal distribution. That is to say, most people are rated in the middle of the rating scale. And the question is that realistic? And I don't think it's realistic at all in small groups. It doesn't make any sense. Look, across a very large organization with hundreds of employees, it probably is true that employees are somewhat normally distributed in terms of their contributions and performance, with most being in the middle, some being exceptionally high, and a small number being low. But I don't think that's a realistic thing to think about in groups of 5, 10, or 15. It's just not realistic. What if there aren't any excellent performers? What if there are no poor performers? Forcing people to identify somebody as a poor performer in a small group seems unrealistic. And this is really important because it leads to some interesting game playing I want you to think about. If you force people in each work group to rate at least one person as a 1 or a 2, that is towards the bottom, and you say you have to do that. You can't turn in ratings where nobody gets a 1 or a 2. And again, I've seen companies do this. They want this kind of quasi-normal distribution. So they want somebody at least to be down towards the bottom. Well, you know what kind of game playing happens is that if I've got a weak employee, and imagine it's my annual rating cycle goes from January to December. Performance ratings are completed in January of the next year. All right. And in the middle of the year, in June, I realize I've got an employee who's very weak. This is an employee who probably ought to be let go. They're just not getting their work done. Their work is of poor quality. They're difficult to manage. They're disruptive to the team, etc. This is a weak employee, and I'd like to have them leave the organization. Well, you know what happens? What happens is in June, I don't let that person go, because I want to hang on to that person, because at the end of the year when I do my performance ratings, I want that person to be the person who's still here, who I can give a 1 or a 2 rating to, thereby fulfilling my obligation to at least give somebody a 1 or a 2 rating. And because I'm thinking to myself, if I let this person go now in June, which is of course what I really ought to do, what will I do when the annual ratings have to get done at the end of the year? I'm going to have to give one of my good employees a 1 or a 2 rating, or at least one of my average employees a 1 or 2 rating. I don't want to do that. So people begin to play games, and that's a dysfunctional side effect of these kinds of forced distributions. One that might not be obvious if you haven't thought about them, but again happens in the real world. Therefore, some companies I'm familiar with refuse to require that some people get a 1 or a 2. They say, listen, if you've got a weak performer, talk to HR. Let's make a decision to move that person out of the business as soon as that is clearly established. If that happens in the middle of the year, that's fine. We're not going to worry about you having somebody else identified as a 1 or a 2 at the end of the year. This original idea of rating some people at the bottom was called rank and yank. Actually, that original name, by the way, came from I just blanked on their name. Enron. Sorry, it was Enron who invented that. Of course, Enron went out of business, as you all know. Horrible company if you know anything about their culture. But the idea was that people in the bottom categories will lose their jobs. And way back in 2000, Jack Welch, then the CEO of General Electric, made that argument. But in fact, General Electric really only did that for 1 or 2 years. So it's really overstated that General Electric routinely had a rank and yank policy. That's not true. And critics have argued that if you do that, it's just not a sustainable approach. There are financial costs to letting these people go, emotional costs. It undermines collaboration because employees begin to compete against each other. People don't engage in citizenship behavior. That is to say, they're not helpful to each other. And the bottom line is, in the long run, it's not a sustainable approach. And I think almost everybody agrees with that at this point. Now, you might say, well, which of these approaches, this approach where you can rate people any way you want, versus you have to have some kind of relative ranking, where you have to say, listen, you need to tell me who are your best 10%, who are the next 15%, who's in the middle, who are your weakest. Which of those are most strongly correlated with objective measures of performance, like sales volume and production quantity? And the answer is, it's the relative approach. Yeah, that's the relative approach. And here's what happens. If you let managers rate people any way they like, what almost always happens in most organizations is that ratings become very lenient very quickly. And the reason for that is because it's hard for a manager to tell one of his or her people that I only gave you a 3. Because to a lot of people, getting a 3 feels like you got a C grade. And most employees don't feel like they're C students. And they probably aren't, actually. So managers tend to want to give everybody high grades. So almost everybody winds up getting a 4 or a 5. And in many organizations, the vast majority of people get 5s. Now you might say, well, again, is there any harm in that? Well, if other managers aren't doing the same thing, again, we're going to have a perceptual problem. Somebody's going to look at their manager and say, my manager's not being fair. But here's another problem. Imagine you wind up in a circumstance where 60 or 70% of the people get a 5 rating. And again, I've seen this. Well, imagine you are genuinely one of the top people in that group, in your work group. You are a genuine star. And you know it, and everybody else knows it. Your contributions are extraordinary. And of course, you do get a 5. But so do lots of other people. And how do you feel when that happens? My guess is you feel like you're being treated unfairly. I'm killing myself. I'm delivering a really high level of contribution here. I'm working hard. I'm working hard every day. I'm thinking a lot. I'm doing more than other people are. I've had multiple successes this year. Nobody else has had successes at this level. And yet I got the same rating that most people got. And when that happens, those top people, when that happens, then those top people want to leave. They want to go someplace else. Now, somebody just asked a question. It's a really good question. Is, do you know how other people were rated? Well, that depends. So there are some companies that actually share the rating distributions. Usually not for each boss, but usually at least at some level they share the rating distributions. So you might say, here are the rating distributions in this department or in this division, right? Or in this area of the business. And many companies do that. And that gives you a feel for where you are relative to other people. So I've seen a number of companies that do that. But even if the company doesn't make those things public, what happens is that people often talk about the ratings they got. So if you're in a circumstance where you have a rating system that allows a lot of people to get very, very high ratings, and you're genuinely star employees, also get top ratings, but they realize, yeah, I'm killing myself, but everybody else is getting high ratings too. That doesn't seem fair. And those people then begin to look around and decide they're going to go someplace else where their contributions are going to be better acknowledged and better appreciated. And you wind up losing top talent. And that's one of the reasons why companies move towards these forced distributions. Despite the fact, of course, that the forced distributions themselves have problems. As I said, when you have forced distributions and you put 60 or 70% of your people in the middle box getting a 3, even if you call them valued employees, a lot of people have said to me, I've actually heard people say this, I feel like they're telling me I'm a C employee, even though the company is explicitly going out of their way to say, no, we're not, you're not a C employee. We have great employees, and the people who are getting a 3, they're valued employees. They're really good employees. We really value you. Of course, the other problem with this is when you've got 60 or 70% of people in the middle box, one could reasonably ask, are all those people really the same? You mean, of all those 70% of the people who are getting a 3, you mean to tell me that they really all deserve the same rating? Aren't some of them better than others? Again, so people start complaining and people start wondering. And you can see, almost no matter what decision you make, you're bumping into some real challenges here. This ability to let bosses rate however they want to rate is generally perceived by the majority of employees, not all employees, as being perceived as more fair. But of course, it's often not perceived that way by your top performers. Now, how people will ultimately perceive these ratings is based on 3 things, and I briefly mentioned this in class the other day, and I want to, before we close our brief session tonight, I want to mention these again. Distributive justice or outcome justice is whether or not you think you got the rating you deserved. But there's another kind of justice that people are very sensitive to. That's procedural justice. People want to know that they had a voice, they had an opportunity to provide input. They want to understand that the process is transparent. They want to feel like they got feedback throughout the year. And there's another kind of justice, which is simply called interpersonal justice, which is how you were treated when the results were communicated to you. Was this a concerned, engaging conversation where the manager listened to you and listened to your concerns, or was this just kind of the thing where, come on into my office, I'm going to tell you what your rating was? And as I've said before, and I said in class, procedural justice and interpersonal justice turned out to be very important. People can get ratings that are lower than what they wanted, but they can remain committed to the organization, and they can remain happy with their boss. And I have seen this in organizations that use forced distributions. One kind of final question about this rating distribution dilemma is whether or not putting people into a particular bucket or category, say deciding that somebody is a 3, can that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? The person then kind of says to himself or herself, well, look, they just see me as okay. They see me as in the middle here. 70% of the people are getting 3s. I'm like everybody else. No sense killing myself. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, and I'll do my job, but I don't want to exert too much effort because I know I'm a 3, and I'll always be a 3. And as a result, people kind of get locked into those categories, and they become labeled as a 3, and that affects their sense of self-efficacy. By the way, it's another challenge in all of this that, again, you may not have thought of, is if you're the manager and somebody's a 3 and somebody says to you, what can I do to get a 4 next year? There's no easy answer. Because you can say to the employee, well, here are some things I can encourage you to do. And that's great. But what if the people who got 4s and 5s this year also step up their game? So this employee I'm talking to, Jamie, who got a 3 this year, follows my advice and really exerts a lot of energy and has a terrific next year. But it's also true that all the people who received 4s and 5s also stepped up their game. They had even better years in the next year. Will Jamie get a 4 or a 5? Well, maybe if there's a forced distribution, Jamie won't. You can see the dilemmas, kind of every way you look at it. Yeah. Sometimes the organizational culture affects these kinds of things. In some very competitive kinds of cultures, these relative approaches, very competitive approaches, ranking people, as saying only a certain percentage can get a 5, only a certain percent can get a 4. Those can often be more acceptable in that kind of a culture. It might be much less acceptable in other cultures. At LaSalle, I believe that approach would generally be not acceptable. People at LaSalle, their kind of general view is that they're not happy about the idea that we would be in deep competition with each other about ratings. And although right now LaSalle's staff doesn't have a formal rating process, and LaSalle's faculty, their ratings are based on their publications, their citations, their course evaluations, etc., where there's more objective data. I want to close our session by just reminding you that on top of everything else, there are legal issues here. 3 laws come to mind right away. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. That's a law that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. The ADEA, which is known as the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, which prohibits discrimination against employees who are 40 and over. And the ADA, known as the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there have been a number of companies that have used forced distributions and have forced a certain percentage of people, maybe 10% or 5%, to get a 1 or a 2. And some of those companies have wound up in court. I know this happened with General Motors. It's happened with other companies as well. For example, at General Motors, when they used to do this, I don't think they do it anymore, but when they used to do it, and you looked at the people who got 1s or 2s, they were disproportionately people who were 60 and over. So a much higher percentage of people who were 60 and over got 1s or 2 than did people in other age groups. That led to a lawsuit, which ultimately General Motors settled out of court, but needless to say, cost them many millions of dollars. And any organization that uses forced distributions should be concerned about this and should be thinking, whatever we do, we should look at the characteristics of the people who get ratings in each of those 5 boxes and make sure that no one group seems to be overrepresented or underrepresented based on race, sex, religion, national origin, age, disability, etc. So legal issues are there and they cannot be avoided. So my intent here tonight is not to offer some simple prescription. It is to say that you're going to have a choice. In the real world, there's a choice. One, will you have ratings at all? And right now you might be saying, well, this thing is such a damn mess. I don't even want to have ratings. But you know, as you start reading about not having ratings, you're going to see that creates a big mess too. If you decide to have ratings, you're going to have to make the choice about whether or not you have a forced distribution, kind of what are called relative or kind of more competitive ratings, or you allow an absolute distribution where bosses can rate people any way they want. There's pros and cons of each of those. They're going to have something to do with the culture of the organization about what's acceptable or not. And as would be the case in the real world, in your application paper, I want to see you tackle these 2 issues very explicitly, and I want to see a real clear justification for the decisions that you make. So let me pause. You have any questions at this point? Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or just type me a question. So one person asked an important question, which is, when are the assignments due? So again, the assignment from last night, right? That's the assignment where I asked you to read the article by Bill Sheeman on alignment. That's due Sunday. Okay, that's due Sunday. And you can send that to me by way of email. Although at this point, I think all of you should be in a situation where the system has been fixed and you can now simply submit it directly through Canvas. So either way you want to send it to me, that's fine. The vast majority, you already sent me some examples of informal recognition practices that are used in your organization, but a couple of you still owe that to me. So you owe that to me by the end of this evening. Again, I will bundle those together, try to do some sensible editing of them, and put them out there so you can see what those things look like. Other questions? So somebody asked, can I name a company that has an effective rating distribution? And I would say that I've never seen a company that has a rating distribution that where nobody complains. I've never seen it. Again, a number of companies I know use a relative rating distribution, and people complain about that, but when they don't have one, they complain about it as well. So I can't simply say, oh, here's an example of a rating distribution where nobody complains. I've seen them where I think they're a good fit for the company. Church & Dwight is a consumer product company, for example, well known. Most people know them as the Arm & Hammer company, but they do lots of other things. And they have a relative rating distribution. About 65–70% of people get a 3. Small percentage of people get a 4. Very small, only 5 or 10% get a 5. And usually only 2–3% are getting ratings of 1 or 2. That's worked relatively well for them for a while. But I know that they're reconsidering that right now as well, as everybody is. Everybody's constantly looking at these things. Somebody asked about the quick assignment about that I just asked people to do. And all I asked people to do was to submit, just real quick by way of email to me, a couple of examples of recognition practices that happen in organizations where you work. How are people informally recognized? I'm not talking about the annual reviews or anything, but just kind of ongoing ways that companies find ways to share their appreciation. Okay? Or managers find ways to share their appreciation. It could be just a single manager. What does a single manager do? That's a nice way to recognize people. I'm just looking for examples of those, so share 2 or 3 of those with me by way of email. Any other questions? Okay. So I know there's no easy answers from tonight, but I hope it will help you think. And I'd like to have you just fill out this poll and just indicate to me whether or not kind of my walking through some of these things, which you don't tend to read about, but are real life things, whether or not this has been helpful to you. And almost everybody's voted. Thanks, we've got everybody voting, and that's very appreciative. Looks like people found this to be useful at some level. Again, these are the kinds of tricks you pick up and issues you pick up by dealing with this kind of stuff day in and day out in a consulting life. So I thank you very much. I think that I hope you will have a much better tomorrow. We will see each other Saturday at 10 o'clock. We'll be talking about 360-degree feedback. Remember, 10 o'clock. And it's supposed to be really, really cold on Saturday. So please dress warmly and stay safe. I'll see you all on Saturday. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.